Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are beginning Journal Collection number 41, and this dates from the year 1850, and Emerson will turn 47 in May of this year. And like always, we have a little bit of a biographical insertion here from the editor, which I will read. The old year ended, and the new began as usual with lyceum lectures through New England. Then followed the delivery before the Mercantile Library Association in New York of two lectures on the Times and England. End note. January 13th, 1850. In ideal faces I notice unity of expression, in portraits, variety and compromise, as if in each individual were 4 or 5 rival natures, one of which was now in the ascendant, and compelled at certain hours to yield the lead to the suppressed rival. Every man finds room in his face for all his ancestors, every face an atrium. New York, January 23rd. What cunning magnets these boys are, to draw all the iron out of the hour. Editor's note. Here follows Mr. Emerson's version of Nisami's Nightingale and Falcon, from the German of von Hammer-Purgstall, which is printed in Persian Poetry, Letters and Social Aims, pages 261 to 262. End note. The two statements or bipolarity. My geometry cannot span the extremes of points which I see. I affirm melioration, which nature teaches in pairs in the domesticated animals and in her secular geology, and the development of complex races. I affirm also the self-equality of nature, or that only that is true which is always true, and that in California or in Greece or in Jewry or in Arcadia existed the same amount of private power as now in the same deductions, however differently distributed. But I cannot reconcile these two statements. I affirm the sacredness of the individual, the infinite reliance that may be put on his determination. I see also the benefits of cities and the plausibility of phalansteries, but I cannot reconcile these oppositions. I affirm the divinity of man, but as I know well how much is my debt to bread and coffee and flannel and heated room, I shun to be Tartuffe, and do affirm also with emphasis the value of these fomentations. But I cannot reconcile that absolute with this conditional. My ancient companion in Charleston, South Carolina, Mr. Martin Luther Hurlbut, used to reply to each statement of mine, "Yes, to a certain extent." I am struck now and then with a passage of poetry or prose, which, especially if written some 100 years ago, amazes me by the fortitude or self-reliance it discovers in the man who dared thus firmly to trust his rare perception as to write it elaborately out. Such a piece as Dawn's Ecstasy. Another is Ferideddin Ittar, the Persian poet's mysticism in the Bird Talk, which I find in von Hammer, when the 3 birds appear before the throne of the Simorg. Love is temporary and ends with marriage. Marriage is the perfection which love aimed at, ignorant of what it sought. Marriage is a good known only to the parties, a relation of perfect understanding, aid, contentment, possession of themselves and of the world, which dwarfs love to green fruit. The English journals snub my new book, as indeed they have all its foregoers. Only now they say that this has less vigor and originality than the others. Where then was the degree of merit that entitled my books to their notice? They have never admitted the claims of either of them. The fate of my books is like the impression of my face. My acquaintances, as long back as I can remember, have always said, "Seems to me you look a little thinner than when I saw you last." The Times. That is to say, there is fate. Laws of the world, what then? We are thrown back on rectitude forever and ever. Only rectitude, to mend one. That is all we can do. But the world stigmatizes as a sterile chimney-corner philosophy. At Alcott conversion on "the times," each person who opened his lips seemed in snuffing the air to snuff nitrous oxide, and away he went, a spinning dervish, pleasing himself, annoying the rest. A talent is a nuisance. Each rode his nag with devotion round the walls of the universe. I found no benefit in this jar and jangle. There was much ability and good meaning in the room, but some persons present who should not have been there, and these, like an east wind, checked every growth. Byron's life suggests that a partnership of authors would have the same immense advantage for literature that concert has in war and in music and in trade. Byron's because, in his case, as in so many, in mine, for example, who am hardly a writer, his talent is conspicuously partial and needs a complement. But if one with solid knowledge, a man of massive mind, or a man of ideas, powerful generalizations, or both, had united with Byron, with his unmatched expressiveness, his heart, his firm ductile thread of gold, a battery had been built against which nothing could stand. But in his isolation, Byron is starved for material, has no thoughts, and his fiery affections are only so many women, though rigged out in men's clothes, garnished too with beards and mustachios. They vapor. It is well worth thinking on. Thus, if Thoreau, Ellery, and I could, which is perhaps impossible, combine works heartily, being fired by such a desire to carry one point as to fuse all our repulsions and incompatibilities, I doubt not we could engender something superior for quality and for effect to any of the thin, cold-blooded creatures we have hitherto flung into the light. February 19th. The Times. I am part of the solar system. Let the brain alone, and it will keep time with that as the shell with the sea tide. We are made of ideas. Let the river roll which way it will, cities will rise on its banks. Let us be glad to breathe the great air, and if we are born in the geographical age, when the Niger and Sacramento are explored, and the North and South Poles touched, roads built, seas sounded, and charts drawn, let us do these with good will. There is a curious shame in our faces. The age is convict, confessing, sits on the anxious benches. We say there is no religion, no poetry, no heroism, no rage. Death is unperfumed, age of debility, correctness, levity of the looking-glass. Not to be bruised by the bruisers, not to despond in cities, is a mark of merit. I hold that all the elements are ever co-present, that what is once true is always true, that every day is the finest in the year, what was background once is foreground now. You say there is no religion now. Above I have written of the necessity of leaving much to the supreme geometer, nor being annoyed if we cannot demonstrate the theorem. We are sure that, though we know not how, necessity does comport with liberty, the individual with the world, my polarity with the spirit of the times. We men are necessary to each other, yet every one stands on the top of the world, over the nadir and under the zenith. So the riddle of the age has always a private solution. Read in Goethe's Winckelmann our cheerful, Franklin-like philosopher's friendly view of the world. He is considerate and patronizing a little, be sure, to the gods. Quote, when the healthy nature of man works as a whole, when he feels himself in the world, as in a large, beautiful, worthy, and solid whole, when the harmonious well-being assures him a clear, free joy, then would the universe, if it could be conscious, exult as arrived at its aim, and admire the summit of its own becoming and being. I value the clergy on the ground that it is the planting of a qualified man in every town whose whole business is to do good in every form. The difference between the saint and the scholar intellectually is that, whilst the scholar too has many divine thoughts, he uses them to a convenient and conventional purpose for a treatise or a history, but the other not only has thoughts, but the copula that joins them is also a thought. Quote, knowledge subsists according to the nature of that which knows, and not according to the nature of that which is known. Proclus, Theol, Plato, Vol.2, but original with Jamblichus. I remember that when I read a lecture in New York, in which I inserted some notice of Paul de Vigueur, Mr. Bartlett in his bookstore inquired where I found her story, and I having forgotten what German book it was, he believed that I had invented them. Then there's an interesting footnote here which I will read. The lecture was Beauty, and Mr. Emerson found the charming story of this lady in a German book published in Darmstadt, 1835, The Letters of Johann Heinrich Merck from Goethe, Herder, Wieland, and others. In a letter from Sommering to Merck, the story rehearsed by Mr. Emerson is told. Larousse, in his encyclopedia, tells of Paul de Vigueur at more length. End of note. Samuel Hoare, Esquire. Mr. Hoare is and remains an entire stranger all his life long, not only in his village, but in his family. He might bow and touch his hat to his wife and daughter as well as to the president. He does the same thing in politics, and at the bar. It is not any new light that he sheds on the case, but his election of a side and the giving his statuesque dignity to that side, that weighs with juries or with conventions, for he does this naturally. Editor's note. In February was held at 15 Tremont Place in Boston a Parliament on the Times, so called on the card announcing it, evidently for the purposes of gathering an audience for Mr. Alcott. A reporter of the first meeting, written by Miss Ariana Walker, is given in the Memoirs of Alcott by F. B. Sanborn and William T. Harris, Volume 2, pages 414 to 418. A later meeting was held at the Town and Country Club. End note. February. I would have a man of large designs use our little Boston and noisy New York as suburbs and villages to try his pieces on and find their faults and supply a good hint if they can. Then let him take them to London or to Paris or to whatever Rome his age affords him, and read them tentatively there, too, not trusting his audience much since, and then there's an untranslated Italian phrase, with a reference still to his ultimate tribunal, namely the few scattered, sensible men, 2 or 3 in the world at a time, who scattered thinly over the ages are called by excellent posterity because they determine its opinion. Superlative. The talent sucks the substance of the man. How often we repeat the disappointment of inferring general ability from conspicuous particular ability. But the accumulation on one point has drained the trunk. Blessed are those who have no talent. The expressors are the gods of the world, Shakespeare and the rest, but the same men whom these expressors revere are the solid, balanced, undemonstrative citizens who make the reserved guard, the central sense of the world. 'Tis because he is not well mixed that he needs to do some feat by way of fine or expiation. Carlyle. Carlyle is wonderful for his rhetorical skill. This trick of rhyme, burden, or refrain, which he uses so well, he not only employs in each new paragraph, suddenly treating you with the last ritornello, but in each new essay or book quoting the burden or chorus of the last book. You know me and I know you, or here we are again, come take me up again on your shoulders, is the import of this. He has the skill to make divine oratorios in praise of the Strand, Kensington, and Kew. He contrives in each piece to make out of his theme or lucky expression a proverb before he has done, and this conclusion of the last is the exordium of the next chapter. It is not the least characteristic sign of the times that Alcott should have been able to collect such a good company of the best heads for 2 Monday evenings for the express purpose of discussing the times. What was never done by human beings in another age was done now. There they met to discuss their own breath, to speculate on their own navels, with eyeglass and solar microscope, and no man wondered at them. But these very men came in the cars, by steam ferry and locomotive to the meeting, and sympathized with engineers and Californians. Mad contradictions flavor all our dishes. Common sense eloquence. Lord Mansfield's merit is like that of Plato, Montaigne, Sam Johnson, Socrates, and Shakespeare, namely in his common sense. Each of those decisions contains a level sentence or two which hit the mark. His sentences are not finished outwardly, but are inwardly. His sentences are involved, but are a solid proposition is set forth, a true distinction is drawn. But Alcott can never finish a sentence, but revolves and spirals until he is lost in air. And it is true that Johnson earned his fame. His reported conversation is up to his reputation. Lords Camden and Kenyon sneered at Mansfield's equitable decisions, meaning thereby to disparage his learning. St. Augustine. Of Memory, Admirable Analysis, Oxford edition, pages 188 to 203, and with an admirable conclusion, page 202, quote, "But where in my memory residest thou, O Lord?" etc., and, quote, "Too late I loved thee, O thou beauty of ancient days, yet ever new, too late I love thee," etc. 7 Years in the Vat. Ellery Channing thinks the merit of Irving's Life of Goldsmith is that he has not the egotism to put in a single new sentence. It is nothing but an agreeable repetition of Boswell, Johnson, and company. And so Montaigne is good, because there is nothing that has not already been in books, a good book being a Damascus blade made by the welding of old nails and horseshoes. Everything has seen service and been proved by wear and tear in the world for centuries, and yet now the article is brand new. So Pope had but one good line, and that he got from Dryden, and therefore Pope is the best and only readable English poet. The Age. God flung into the world in these last ages 2 toys, a magnet and a looking-glass, and the children of men have occupied themselves wholly with one or the other, or with both. Swedenborg, Descartes, and all the philosophers, both natural and moral, turned themselves into magnets, and have not ceased to express in every way their sense of polarity. Schelling and the existing thinkers most of all. The most unexpected splendid effects are produced by this principle, as a cone is generated by the revolution of a triangle. Religions, philosophies, friendships, loves, poetries, literatures, are all hid in the horseshoe magnet, as galvanism, electricity, chemistry, heat, light, and life and thought are at last only powers of this fruitful phenomenon. A single example occurs for 1,000. Society disgusts, and the poet resolves to go into retirement and indulge this great heart and feed his thought henceforward with botany and astronomy. Behold, on the instant his appetites are exasperated. He wants dinners and concerts, scholars and fine women, theatre and club, and life consists in managing adroitly these antagonisms to intensate each other. Life must have continence and abandonment. For the looking-glass effect was scarcely less. Poor dear Narcissus pines on the fountain-side. Colonel Fremont on the Rocky Mountain says, "How we look!" and all the cities and nations think what the English, what the French, what the Americans will say. Next, the trick of philosophizing is inveterate and reaches its height. And last, symbolism is the looking-glass raised to the highest power. I wrote above, quote, "What I want to know is the meaning of what I do," believing that any of my current Mondays or Tuesdays is fate book enough for me, believing that hints and telegraphic signals are arriving to me every moment out of the interior eternity. I am tormented with impatience to make them out. Garrison is venerable in his place, like the tart Luther, but he cannot understand anything you say, and neighs like a horse when you suggest a new consideration, as when I told him that the fate element in the Negro question he had never considered. Quote, "So that the state only exists, I shall never want anything," said the great Conde, and paid the army himself. Lord Mahon. And below this is a short French quotation which has no translation in the footnotes. Abuse is a pledge that you are felt. If they praise you, you will work no revolution. Language is a quite wonderful city which we all help to build, but each word is like a work of nature, determined 1,000 years ago and not alterable. We confer and dispute and settle the meaning so or so, but it remains what it was in spite of us. The word beats all the speakers and definers of it, and stands to their children what it stood to their fathers. As far as I know, the misfortune of New England is that the Southerner always beats us in politics, and for this reason, that it comes at Washington to a game of personalities. The Southerner has personality, has temperament, has manners, persuasion, address, and terror. The cold Yankee has wealth, numbers, intellect, material power of all sorts, but has not fire or firmness, and is coaxed and talked and bantered and shamed and scared till he votes away the dominion of his millions at home. He never comes back quite the same man he went, but he has been handled, tampered with. What is the remedy? Plainly, I think that we must borrow a hint from the military art. The Hungarians said they could have easily beaten the Russians if in any manner they could have made them run. But the Russian soldier is more afraid of his officers than of the enemy. If he runs, he will assuredly be shot. If he fights, he has a chance of escape, and therefore he is cut down and butchered, but dares not run. So let our representative know that if he misrepresents his constituency, there is no recovery from social damnation at home. A footnote states, in these months the debate on further concessions to the South with regard to slavery, including the infamous fugitive slave law, was going on in Congress. Mr. Webster, to the consternation and grief of the Friends of Liberty, justifying its sacrifice on the altar of the Union. Majority. Quote, the army of unright is encamped from pole to pole, but the road to victory is known to the dervish. Intellect. Lagrange thought Newton fortunate in this that the law of universal gravitation could be discovered but once, whilst the discoverer of the Cape of Good Hope had a rival in the discoverer of Cape Horn, of Arctic Sea and land and Antarctic Sea and land. And yet in metaphysics there is no terminus, and therefore no final discovery. Hegel or Oken or whosoever shall enunciate the law which necessitates gravitation as a phenomenon of a larger law, embracing mind and matter, diminishes Newton. How many centers we have fondly found which prove soon to be circumferential points! How many conversations or books seemed epochs at the moment which we have now actually forgotten! As I read of Wolsey yesterday, the boy bachelor at Oxford, where afterwards he built the beautiful tower of Magdalen College Chapel, and his early success with the wise old Henry VII, it seemed that the true distinction and royalty of kings consists in this privilege of having pure truth in business spoken to them. They have the telegraphic despatch. No man dare lie to them. For a good account of Wolsey, see Wood's Athene Oxyensis, 1, page 666. These children of fashion have found no more satisfaction in their element than the other experimenters, and they are sallying into our pastures to see if, maybe, it is not there. I think how many superstitions we have. Patrick Jackson did not go to college, and therefore never quite felt himself the equal of his own brothers who did. Dancing and equitation, which property denied to me, I beheld in all my youth with awe and unquestioning respect. Town and Country Club. The members are listed. 1849. Caleb Stetson, Hill, T. Davis, Samuel Osgood, Charles T. Brooks, Samuel Longfellow, George F. Simmons, Francis Cunningham, Frederick A. Eustace, C. Farrer, Thomas B. Mackey, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Gage, Thompson, Joseph Angier, Thomas Starr King, William B. Greene, James R. Lowell, H. W. Longfellow, William A. Tappan, LeBaron Russell, Samuel Gray Ward, George B. Emerson, Samuel K. Lothrop, George P. Bradford, T. Lee, G. Russell, Edward Bangs, J. Elliott Cabot, Edward E. Hale, C. C. Shackelford. Honorary. C.P. Cranch, Horace Bushnell, W.H. Channing, Dugan, Hicks, Powers, Horatio Greenough, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Ward Beecher, J. Whelpley, Henry James, R. M. S. Jackson, J. Peter Leslie. 1850, S. G. Ward, J. W. Brown, Edward Bangs, A. B. Alcott, W. E. Channing, J. E. Cabot, J. R. Lowell, T. S. King, L. B. Russell, W. B. Greene, E. E. Hale, C. C. Shackford, T. Parker, J. S. Dwight, W. E. Goodson, J. P. Bradford, J. F. Clark, W. H. Channing, E. P. Whipple, G. R. Loring, W. F. Channing. Editor's note. But the vision of a club of friends bound together, not by conscience, ideas of duty and of reform, but men genial, poets, and withal having a saving sense of humor, hovered before Mr. Emerson's eyes, premonition of the Saturday Club. In a letter to Mr. Samuel Ward, written February 24th, he said, quote, I saw Longfellow at Lowell's 2 days ago, and he declared that his faith in clubs was firm. Quote, I will very gladly, he said, meet with Ward and you and Lowell and 3 or 4 others and dine together. Lowell remarked, quote, well, if he agrees to the dinner, though he refuses the supper, we will continue the dinner until next morning. Just now Lowell has been seized with aggravated symptoms of the magazine. Emerson's Letters to a Friend, number 33. End note. What follows is a poem entitled Spring. In the garden goes now the wind over the water, to file and to polish the cheeks of the pond. On tulips plays now the reflection of fire, which plays now no more in chimney and hearth. He who yesterday withdrew himself from affairs, him now desired, sets again in activity. The part that is built teaches the architect how to build the rest. The streets compress the mob into battalions. Who taught Raphael and Correggio how to draw? Was it Signor Quadro, the perspective master, with his rule and dividers? No, it was the weather stains on the wall, the cloud over the house roof yonder, with that shoulder of Hercules and brow of Jove. It was marbled paper, it was a lucky scratch with a bit of charcoal, which taught the secret of possibility and confounded and annihilated Signor Quadro and themselves also. The impressionable man. In the woods I have one guide, namely to follow the light, to go where the woods are thinnest. Then at last I am sure to come out. So he cannot be betrayed or misguided, for he knows where the north is, knows painfully when he is going in the wrong direction. Memory, imagination, reason are only modes of the same power, as lampblack and diamond are the same chemical matter in different arrangement. Quote, Animus habet non habitur, Sallust. Abandon. Men of genius, quote, give out oracles when they are agitated, but are no more than men when they are calm, De Stael. Quote, to stand on one's own feet, is the maxim of Demosthenes, as of Chatham says herein and all his orations. And it is in the oration of the, and then there's an untranslated Greek words here, or classes. He has the best sense whose face is not good only for one particular thing, but, as Rose Flammock says of her father's, it is like his yardstick, which will measure dowlas and also cloth of gold. Shakespeare was like a looking-glass carried through the street. Quote, did I not drum well? Said Mr. Gray to somebody who taunted him with being a drummer's boy. Personality. The reason why the highwayman masters the traveler is not his pistol, but his personality. If the party attacked had really the superiority in character and love, he could really conquer without arms. But he must be so charged and surcharged with love that he is as good a highwayman as the highwayman. You shall not match the pirate with a goody, but with a pirate, in other words, in natural force, and more determined and absolute by dint of his heart than the other by help of his arms. Colonel Forbes, an Englishman who served in Garibaldi's army, told me of his being stopped by brigands in the night in a carriage in Italy. He got out of the coach and walked up to them. "What do you want?" No answer. "Do you want money?" Yes. Their guns were aimed. He walked directly up to them, and they drew up their guns. "My good fellows, you have made a mistake. We are soldiers sent by the government to Siena. We have no money, not even to pay our fare or dinner. It is all paid by order of the government. I wish you better luck the next time." Get in," to his companions, and tied in the horses, and off with "Addio, arrivederci." I should like to set a sculptor to put a face on a church door that should draw and keep a crowd about it all the daytime by its character, good nature, and inscrutable meaning. Watson Haynes, the sailor, testifies that when he attempted to enlist the clergy in his crusade against flogging in the navy, they replied that their business was to preach the gospel and not to interfere with the regulations of the navy. And Webster thinks the gospel was to touch the heart and not to abolish slavery. Washington Allston, when he painted blue sky, began as nature does, with a ground of deep black, and painted the light on that. And when he had occasion to paint a gem, he wrought on it as long as a lapidary. Editor's note: in March and April, Mr. Emerson gave courses in New York and Philadelphia, also lectures in Brooklyn and in Paterson, New Jersey. End note. Philadelphia, April 6th. I think a novel like Shirley must cultivate its readers. It is very useful to each in his kind. I saw at once how a treatise on the conduct of life would draw men, quote, to the exclusion of caucus and theater. I read on a tombstone, Elizabeth Rowe died aged 25. She was, words is wanting to tell what she was. Think what a true friend can be. She was that. I have made no note of these long, weary absences at New York and Philadelphia. I am a bad traveler, and the hotels are mortifications to all sense of well-being in me. The people who fill them oppress me with their excessive virility, and would soon become intolerable if it were not for a few friends, who, like women, tempered the acrid mass. Henry James was true comfort, wise, gentle, polished, with heroic manners, and a serenity like the sun. April. The worst symptom I have noticed in our politics lately is the attempt to make a jibe out of Seward's appeal to a higher law than the Constitution, and Webster has taken part in it. I have seen him snubbed as Higher Law Seward, and now followed by Rufus Choate in his phrase, quote, "the trashy sentimentalism of our lute-string enthusiasts." Lucretia Mott is the flower of Quakerism. That woman has a unity of sense, virtue, and good meaning perfectly impressed on her countenance, which are a guarantee of victory in all the fights to which her Quaker faith and connection lead her. She told exceedingly well the story of her contest with the mob at Dover and Smyrna in Delaware, she and the wife of Mr. attending him down to the place where the mob were to tar and feather him, and it was perfectly easy to see that she might safely go, and would surely defend herself and him. No mob could remain a mob where she went. She brings domesticity and common sense, and that propriety which every man loves, directly into this hurly-burly, and makes every bully ashamed. Her courage is no merit, one almost says, where triumph is so sure. Daniel Webster. I think there was never an event half so painful occurred in Boston as the letter with 800 signatures to Webster. The siege of Boston was a day of glory. This was a day of petticoats, a day of imbecilities, the day of the old women, la veille. Many of the names very properly belong there. They are the names of aged and infirm people who have outlived everything but their nightcap and their tea and toast, but I observe some names of men under 40. I observe that very few lawyers have set their names. They are a prudent race, though not very fond of liberty. It seems 'tis now settled that men in Congress have no opinions, that they may be had for any opinion, any purpose. Understanding is the thing required in a member. Virtue is very good in country places, but impertinent in public men. 'Tis virtue which they want, and wanting it, honor no garment to their backs can fit. Ben Jonson, Cynthia's Revels. Then there is a Latin inscription here, which I will read in the English translation in the footnotes. Seldom does retribution with her lame foot forsake the trail of crime. The badness of the times is making death attractive. Andrew Fletcher, quote, would give his life to serve his country, but would not do a mean act to save it. End quote. At the Concord celebration, I was struck with the talent of Everett and Choate, and the delight of the people in listening to their eloquence. There have been millions and millions of men, and a good stump orator only once in an age. Governor Briggs is an excellent middleman. He looks well when speaking, and seems always just ready to say something good, but never said anything. He is an orator manqué. Rantoul had an inestimable advantage in belonging to the Locofoco party. All his tediousness, all his wearisomeness about Ionic melody of the father of history, and about the history of Islamism, indeed all those painful exertions which collegians call squirts, were patiently and even proudly heard by the multitude, who were proud of the college learning of their man. In a Whig these would have been intolerable, and all scholars would have suffered from the supposed impatience of the company. Now we sat quite at ease and irresponsible. May 4th. It may be assumed that Nemesis is always leveling, and if by night you should chance to hear the burglar gathering your spoons into his bag, what is it but the caving in of a little sand or pebbles at the edge of the bank, which is always falling? The leveling goes on surely at all hours, whether you watch it or no. Thackeray's Vanity Fair is pathetic in its name, and in his use of the name. An admission it is from a man of fashion in the London of 1850 that poor old Puritan Bunyan was right in his perception of the London of 1650. And yet now in Thackeray is the added wisdom or skepticism that though this be really so, he must yet live in tolerance of and practically in homage and obedience to these illusions. Editor's Note: it appears from Mr. Emerson's account book that in the middle of June he made a journey in the quote-unquote New West, first to Cincinnati, and from there visited the Mammoth Cave, see Illusions, Conduct of Life, pages 309 and 310. He went down the Ohio River and up the Mississippi to St. Louis and then to Galena, crossing Illinois by stage, and Michigan by the new railroad, and then following Lakes Erie and Ontario to connect with the railroad again at Albany. At Niagara Falls, which he saw probably for the first time, he met his friend Mr. John M. Forbes, the deus ex machina of the roads under construction to Chicago, and later to open Iowa and Nebraska and the region beyond. In a letter to Carlyle, number CXXX in the correspondence, Mr. Emerson tells of this western journey and of his walking and sailing 18 miles underground in the Mammoth Cave. End note. It is the scholar's misfortune that his virtues are all on paper, and when the time comes to use them, he rubs his eyes and tries to remember what it is that he should do. July 21st. On Friday, July 19th, Margaret dies on rocks of Fire Island Beach within sight of and within 60 rods of the shore. To the last, her country proves inhospitable to her. Brave, eloquent, subtle, accomplished, devoted, constant soul. There is a footnote which I will read here. For the account of this tragedy, as well as the strange, inspiring life of Margaret Fuller Assoley in New England and her later heroism in the service of the Italians in their unsuccessful rising for liberty in 1848 to 1849, see her memoirs by her friends Emerson, Reverend William H. Channing, and Reverend James Freeman Clarke, also Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson's Margaret Fuller Hasoli. End of note. If nature availed in America to give birth to many such as she, freedom and honor and letters and art too were safe in this new world. She bound in the belt of her sympathy and friendship all who I know and love, Elizabeth, Caroline, Ward, the Channings, Ellen Hooper, Charles Newcomb, Hedge, and Sarah Clark. She knew more select people than any other person did, and her death will interest more. Yet her taste in music, painting, poetry, character would not be on universal but on idiosyncratic grounds, yet would be genuine. She had a wonderful power of inspiring confidence and drawing out of people their last secret. The timorous said, quote, "What shall we do? How shall we be received now that she brings a husband and child home?" End quote. But she had only to open her mouth, and a triumphant success awaited her. She would fast enough have disposed of the circumstances and the bystanders, for she had the impulse, and they wanted it. Here were already mothers waiting tediously for her coming for the education of their daughters. Mrs. Ripley thinks that the marriage with Asoli was like that of de Stael in her widowhood with the young de Rocca, who was enamored of her. And Mrs. Barlow has an unshaken trust that what Margaret did she could well defend. Her love of art, like that of many, was only a confession of sympathy with the artist and the mute condemnation which his work gave to the deformity of our daily life, her co-perception with him of the eloquence of form, her aspiration with him to a life altogether beautiful. Her heart, which few knew, was as great as her mind, which all knew. What Jung Stilling said of Goethe, Elizabeth Hoare says of Margaret, and that she was the largest woman, and not a woman who wished to be a man. I have lost in her my audience. I hurry now to my work, admonished that I have few days left. There should be a gathering of her friends, and some Beethoven should play the dirge. She poured a stream of amber over the endless store of private anecdotes, of bosom histories, which her wonderful persuasion drew out of all to her. When I heard that a trunk of her correspondence had been found and opened, I felt what a panic would strike all her friends, for it was as if a clever reporter had gotten underneath a confessional and agreed to report all that transpired there in Wall Street. Oh yes, Margaret and her friends must be written, but not post-haste. It is an essential line of American history. Quote, "Yes, that is an example of a destiny springing from character." End quote. Quote, "I see your destiny hovering before you, but it always escapes you." End quote. Quote, "Nor custom stale her infinite variety." End quote. Elizabeth Hoare quotes Mrs. Barlow as saying that Margaret never disappointed you. To anyone whose confidence she had once drawn out, she was always faithful. She could, and she was alone in this, talk of persons and never gossip, for she had a fine instinct that kept her from any reality and from any effect of treachery. The fact is, she had large sympathies. Mrs. Barlow has the superiority to say of Margaret, death seems to her a fit and good conclusion to the life. Her life was romantic and exceptional, so let her death be. It sets the seal on her marriage, avoids all questions of society, all of employment, poverty, and old age, and besides was undoubtedly predetermined when the world was created. Dr. W. E. Channing said to her, "Miss Fuller, when I consider that you are all that Miss P. wished to be, and that you despise her, and that she loves you and honors you, I think her place in heaven must be very high." Lydian says that in the fly-leaf of Margaret's Bible was written a hymn of Novalis. She had great tenderness and sympathy, as Aunt Mary has none. If Aunt Mary finds out anything is dear and sacred to you, she instantly flings broken crockery at that. Elizabeth Hoare says of Margaret, her friends were a necklace of diamonds about her neck. The confidences given her were their best, and she held them to them. that the honor of the conversations was the high tone of sincerity and culture from so many consenting individuals, and that Margaret was the keystone of the whole. She was perhaps impatient of complacency in people who thought they had claims and stated their contrary opinion with an air. For such she had no mercy, but though not agreeable, it was just, and so her enemies were made. A larger dialectic, I said, conveys a sense of power and feeling of terror before unknown, and Henry Thoreau said that a thought would destroy like the jet of a blowpipe most persons. And yet we apologize for the power and bow to the persons. I want an electrical machine. Slumbering power we have, but not excited, collected, and discharged. If I should be honest, I should say my exploring of life presents little or nothing of respectable event or action, or in myself of a personality. Too composite to offer a positive unity, but it is a recipiency, a percipiency. And I, and far weaker persons, if it were possible, than I, who pass for nothing but imbeciles, do yet affirm by their percipiency the presence and perfection of law, as much as all the martyrs. It is the charm of practical men that outside of their practicality are a certain poetry and play. Every glance at society, pale, withered people with gold-filled teeth, ghastly, and with minds in the same dilapidated condition, drugged with books for want of wisdom, suggest at once the German thought of the progressive God, who has got thus far with his experiment, but will get out yet a triumphant and faultless race. Men as naturally make a state as caterpillars a web. The relation of men of thought to society is always the same. They abhor Whiggism, they abhor rebellion. They refuse the necessity of mediocre men, that is, to take sides. They keep their own self-poise, and the ecliptic is never parallel with the earth's equator. Two mottos for a genealogy. And then there are two given, one by Claudian with a question mark, and another by Virgil. Both of these are untranslated. This is the end of part 1 of Emerson's journal collection number 41, dating from the year 1850, when the writer was age 47. Thank you for listening.